Hello everyone, my name is Francis Chia Hui Lin. Today I'm going to present a paper for the conference Cities in a Changing World, Questions of Culture, Climate and Design. The title of my paper is The Post-Pandemic Epistemology of Asian Architecture and Urbanism, a postcolonial heterotopia. In current scholarship of architecture, arguably, the theoretical component is subordinate to, or in most cases, to be held up by the state of design and pragmatism. However, the worldwide atmosphere today suggested by the pandemic has foreseen stimulative changes to the stringent status of theory in the discursive development of architecture studies on the road ahead due to the physical limitations caused by the reality. This study is centered around an argument that the resonance of approaching the understanding of architecture implies a strategic turn. This turn is towards a theoretical angle upon the common built environment's limitations caused by the pandemic. As a methodology, Michel Foucault's conceptual notion of heterotopias is focused as one exemplified theoretical perspective. Empirically, Asia and her phenomenon post-coloniality registered in architecture and urbanism are testified. As a strategic refinement of its research design, cases in Japan, Singapore, and Malaysia are comparatively analyzed. The coronavirus disease today has caused a pandemic, and this worldwide disease has caused challenges to the profession and discipline of architecture in all aspects. Architecturally, the unusual social distancing and the intended social isolation imposed by the pandemic are characteristic against the special conventions which have foundations from the social and cultural development of human civilization. This intervention into the existing special conventions of the profession and the discipline has already shaken the epistemology of architecture and urbanism, which the phenomenon is possibly going to last out till the post-pandemic era. The current and dominant epistemology of architecture and urbanism is tied to strong involvement in design and pragmatism because of the immediate contact capacity that has been inclined into architecture scholarship since the debate on the ends of theory was cast in the 1970s. In the edited handbook of architecture theory, which has concisely contextualized the end of theory debate and its impact on contemporary architecture and urban studies, along with practice which are led by materialist or pragmatist attitude. Kressler, Cairns, and Hainan argued that the end of theory atmosphere in academia and later reflected in practice of architecture sprouted from the unstable constellation of approaches, tendencies, and tactics that were gathered under the heading of post-structuralism. That is to say, architecture's engagement with post-structuralist theory indicated that more established conceptions of architecture, the so-called theory of architecture, that was universally inherited in the chronology of the discipline, were increasingly seen as unsatisfactory, as the post-structuralist philosophy encourages multiple definitions of things that are centered around the same essence. The debate on these ends of theory continues to the present day. In an article entitled Post Theory and Beyond, Luis Fernando Valent argued that this history of theory has encountered turns in different aspects. Although the pandemic unfortunately adds limitations and challenges to the current and dominant framework of understanding architecture and producing architecture knowledge, this situation perhaps can be regarded as a momentous turning point of theory becoming once again urgent and timely. The post-pandemic limitations on the epistemology of space should thus be positively seen as the potential for a next version of the epistemology of architecture and urbanism. Heterotopias is a term used by Michel Foucault to identify spaces located between utopias and the real world. Heterotopic spaces can be real, unreal, and surreal. As in heterotopias, foundations of heterogeneity clustered together to form the imagery of commotion. Especially, the notion was elaborated in more details in his speech delivered in 1967, which later was transcribed and translated into English. In this speech, Foucault referred heterotopias to be as locations that are situated between real spaces and utopias, which are at the same time real and unreal, as these spaces showcase the potential of concentrating heterogeneous entities in one same context. To Foucault's elaboration, heterotopias were regarded as reflecting the characteristics of contemporaneity. To systemize this argumentation, Foucault subsequently introduced the 6 well-known principles. The first indicated that heterotopias are being found in every culture in different forms, and the representations of heterotopias appeared chronologically from the awareness of crisis to the placement of deviation. The second characterized the dynamic instrumentality of heterotopias in the history of society. The third conceptually pinpointed the capacity of heterotopias as representing real spaces that allow multiple spatial settings, including those ones that seem to exclude from each other, to be placed together. The further principle was tied to the notion of time that can be perceived differently as pieces and moments. The fifth underscored the enclosure as a mechanism of heterotopias that transcends the physical definition of spaces. The last principle as a notion to be claimed being positioned in between real spaces and utopias specify heterotopia's unique function of decompressing the context of space to allow the approximation between illusion and reality. The connection of heterotopias to the real cases and scenes indeed provides the potential for spatial imagination in relevant studies of architecture, cities, and the geography of different phases. Michel Foucault, however, did not continue to build up the theorization of the notion since his theoretical framing of heterotopia was proposed. This pity, perhaps, allows a positive space for the later researchers to fit in by further imagination and consolidation. To meet the timing of the post-pandemic period, both the revolutionary reconsideration of theory's position in current epistemology of architecture and urbanism, and the legacy of heterotopia's theoretical continuity are empowered with energy to grow, to develop, and to be employed further. Certainly, this continuity in theorizing knowledge of architecture and urbanism needs to adapt in with the present condition. For example, the pandemic's limitations added on to the existing conventions of space in current scholarship and the crucial realization of mediating the impact of globalization both urge the reconfiguration of the relationships between knowledge formations and localities to add in. The pandemic forces people to acknowledge that real spaces not only create the understanding of social intimacy, but also safety distance to alternative derealization. The critical aspect of globalization is actually regional integration, which has been evidenced by the emergence of regional organizations. Together, these now-time conditions give the privilege to the post-pandemic geography of Asia to be approached as an insightful case of region with a geopolitical perspective from their post-coloniality. As the empirical explanation of this study, this paper borrows a post-colonial perspective to elaborate the argumentation over theory of architecture and the challenge or potential for post-pandemic epistemology of architecture and urbanism through an analysis of contemporary Asia's urban built environment in general. The 6 principles proposed by Michel Foucault, when they are revisited along with Asia's post-colonial condition, are suggestive to the adaptive epistemology of architecture and urbanism in the post-pandemic period. The first principle contended by Foucault was that heterotopias are basically everywhere, but with either an active or a passive catalyst. These two agents were indicated by Foucault as a heterotopia of crisis and a heterotopia of deviation. To continue the thought of heterotopias that are conditioned by being actively and passively triggered, this type of heterotopias can be integrated with the transition of Asia's postcoloniality before and after the pandemic. Before the pandemic in Asia, the colonial modernity that has been imposed into an Asian built context can be regarded as an active insertion into Asian architecture and urbanism, whereas the awareness of the COVID-19 safety gradient in the built environment can be seen as the continuity of the passive mode. Singapore's void deck spaces that refer to the ground floor spaces of the HDB housing, which already have been imposed as policy-driven spaces by the Singaporean government to manage the presence of Singapore's multicultural and multiracial historicity, can be read as such heterotopia that follows this principle. As an initial concept, the void deck reflects the crisis of potential cultural and racial confrontation, and the emptiness is an intentional design to moderate and to dilute such possible conflicts with a managed form of neutrality. The void deck, however, with the condition of the pandemic, implies further the deviation of existing spatial conventions forced by the unwilling and unusual regulations of social distancing. The emptiness continues to characteristic of being everywhere in Singapore provides alternative understanding of urban public space that reacts to the unexpected change to the built environment. The second principle of heterotopias was elaborated by Foucault through the redefinition of function that is originally registered to space. This principle, seen from a post-colonial perspective, the Asian architecture and urbanism legitimizes a post-colonial strategy of catastrophes that echoes Helmi Baba's notion of mimicry that implies a form of resistance to colonialism. That is to say, the colonial modernity that externally merged into the Asian built environment, which used to be understood as a representation of Ewasaid's Orientalism, also has the possibility to be re-Orientalized and to function similar resistance to the neo-colonial force that now is entitled to the pandemic rather than the West. In Singapore, the most known representation of Orientalism perhaps can be seen from the government's master plan of shaping the city-state as a city in the garden by mimicking the theory of garden cities suggested by Ebenezer Howard. The most recent case resulted from such outlook for the state's urban landscape can be seen from the completion and opening of the Jewel Changi Airport Shopping Center. In the shopping center, the atmosphere of a tropical rainforest was reconstructed, comprised of waterfalls, vegetations, and carefully filtered nature light. The shopping center, in which is air conditioned, even functions as a transitional space that connecting trains pass by. This Indo-tropical environment enlarges the country's achievement of being ranked as the greenest city in Asia from an Orientalist policy of recreating the image of garden cities in Asia. Nowadays, the greening image seen in Singapore has become iconic of the state. The artificial greening is even more characteristic than the nature conservation. From a theoretical perspective, this can be regarded as the phenomenon of re-Orientalism, that the Orientalist spaces have further mutated into a particular ideological construction. The characteristic of juxtaposition was highlighted by Foucault as the third principle, which suggests a way of interpretation that incompatible entities are placed together in a heterotopia. When Guthrie Spivak's no argument that the subaltern cannot speak is examined with this principle, the Asian subalterns represented in architecture and urbanism appear to have two identities in juxtaposition. One is a group of built objects of Asia that is being subordinated in the Western epistemology that cannot speak, and the other is a group of built objects subjectified in Asia that cannot speak to the worldwide condition of the pandemic. For instance, in Japan, based on the regional and cultural preferences, there's still a strong sense of managing low or middle urban density by deconcentrating the city function into smaller clusters. This low density, however, does not suggest an immediate poor future destiny, and the cannot speak negativity juxtaposes a redefinition of the character, which takes the advantage of its quotation marks to form an urban enclave that registers intense urbanity without being architecturally compromised as a concrete jungle. The principle that Foucault referred to time, no matter whether it is related to the concern with accumulation or not, becomes subjective to the representation of colonial culture when it is connected to the post-colonial condition of Asian architecture and urbanism. The concern was argued by Archus Nandy as a new cultural entity that emerged from within the relationship of domination through a series of learning. In the post-pandemic age, there surely is a new cultural form in space going to appear as either a continuous development of architecture and urban reaction towards the civilization's adaptation into a new page, or a temporary treatment that is established to cope with the pandemic. The unique Hawker Center and in Southeast Asia identify the physical representation of such heterotopia. For instance, in Malaysia, the hawker spaces have evolved from a form of temporality to a permanent setting, whilst the organic, flexible, and flowing characteristics are remained. This can be regarded as a new type of spatial understanding, and the epistemological implication of this cultural production is heterotopically suggestive of spaces that have been regulated by the concern with a pandemic disease, which repeatedly demands both spontaneous and compulsory adjustment of spatial settings. The fifth principle of heterotopias deal with the issue of enclosure. Foucault meant to underscore how a specific atmosphere is concentrated and displayed. This standpoint allows the concern with the colonial modernity to have an alternative explanation that implies a strategic representation of the regional culture politics. In Japan, the iconic billboard architecture can be an Asianized build example. Originally, it was a term to describe the flat facade commercial buildings that sprung up in Tokyo after the destruction of the great 1923 earthquake. The meaning of this term nowadays is widely extended to suggest Japanese architecture that is misused in function and specifically has distinctive exterior. This concept, from a postcolonial perspective, can alternatively be seen as Japan's self-acculturation of the Western imagery that nowadays is regarded as a sign of the Japanese nativeness that showcases its signifier rather than the signified. For the current era of the pandemic, that is depressive and um, uh, stagnated due to the lockdown of the urban and public instrumentality, the billboard architecture is a psychological reference that triggers the dynamics of space and urbanism, which brings positively the hope and energy to urban localities that are unwillingly deprived of humanity. Michel Foucault's last principle of heterotopias is to characterize spaces with sense of illusion and compensation. In Asia, Ababa's post-colonial argumentation of Hong Kong before and after 1997 that displayed the anxiety about political transfer and uncertain identity construction not as a trait of identification, but as an ongoing status of producing culture can be a geopolitical echo. Similarly, the anxiety about the pandemic and the search of an adaptive alternative for the new epistemology and conventions of architecture and urbanism should proceed to a status of being placed in heterotopias in a positive way. The gated imagery characterized by Malaysia's urbanism can be seen as a reverse situation of such elusive or compensated heterotopias. Through the gated imagery, the private space can become compensated with a public atmosphere without compromising its registered security, and the public space can share an imaginative sense of extension that gradually goes into the control zones. Under an alert to the pandemic, such gated imagery brings a heterotopic insight into the theorization of a rational and placeless concept of the epidemic prevention gradient into a sense of belonging, forming adaptive and reactive localities. This paper does not intend to provide a solid solution that defines and functions what the term post-pandemic architecture and urbanism suggests. This paper, however, does stress the fact that the contemporary built environment is threatened by a context of the current pandemic with inapplicability to the existing architectural knowledge and conventions. So in conclusion, different to the current and dominant attention on technologies and pragmatism, this paper takes a position from a theoretical model of abstractness that transcends traditional categories of aesthetics, philosophical or political deduction, but impose views by induction. But comparative analysis between heterotopias and Asia's postcoloniality, the potential for explaining, mediating, and moderating conflicts caused between conventional or Eurocentric knowledge of architecture and the post-pandemic geography can possibly be contoured from a preliminary attempt. And I think this is the end of the presentation. Thank you for your attention.